Welcome to the Peacemaker podcast. This was a podcast that was started back in June during our Peacemakers in a Divided Culture sermon series at True Life Church. We launched off into a podcast, and for the months of June and July, we tackled the issue of race, racial injustice, racial diversity, and its relationship to the church, or the church's role in fighting against those things. And now we took some time off. Now we're picking it back up, and for the election season, which really started a lot, too soon. But for the climax of the election season, a very polarizing election season, we're going to be tackling political topics. We're going to be hearing from people who have various views on political candidates, who are going to be voting differently than each other, have various views on political issues, and we're going to be having reasonable and hopefully humble conversations where we are quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry, as the book of James commands us to do. Because Jesus calls us to be peacemakers. He says that us Christians, those who follow Jesus, are to be peacemakers, not peace fakers, not hide away from difficult, controversial topics, but also not divisive, not pouring more gasoline on the fire like so much of the world is doing right now. We are to be peacemakers. We should be able to say, hey, I don't agree with that view. Can you help me understand why you believe that? That's the point of this. My hope is that we learn something as we listen to people, even people in our own church who have different views. My hope is that we can learn something by having these nuanced conversations. And then also that we can then go and follow their lead by having humble, reasonable conversations with the people in our lives who we disagree with. So enjoy. I pray that God uses it. This first episode is with two of my friends, Tom Sargent and Leigh Nelson. I've spent a lot of time with both these guys who are friends with each other, having political conversations. I learn a lot from both of them, and they disagree pretty adamantly on most topics. Tom is a Christian, Leigh is not. Tom calls himself a conservative, Leigh calls himself a liberal. You're going to find out why, but you're also going to find out why they can still be friends. Check it out. So, all right. So, Tom, you are can you describe yourself? Can we start off by you describing yourself? I mean, I'm friends with both of you guys, but you both are very, very different, both from a faith standpoint, a religious standpoint, political standpoint. Can you kind of categorize where you land?
Okay, for the political standpoint, I would generally fall on the conservative side of things as it's currently understood. The conservative side of things, both I would say socially as well as economically, in most with some variations, but as far as social conservatism and as well as political and economic conservatism, even though I'm not sure economic conservatism really exists anymore, but for as much as it exists, I'm in generally that realm with a few areas where I stray from the path, and from the religious standpoint, coming at it from a Christian point of view. That's sort of my lane, I'd say.
Okay. What about you, Leigh?
I'm generally lean very liberal on most issues. I found it interesting as, I'm getting a little older and finding out, certain topics where I find that there are others to the left of me. And I always find that interesting to see what those are and whether it's, I wonder, is it my, viewpoints changing as I get older? Is the world changing around me? I'm staying the same, just to try and kind of identify there, because, I remember a day when I voted Ralph Nader because Al Gore was not liberal enough for me. He was not progressive enough. And, so, of course, in New Jersey, in a system where a vote for anybody, it's all but decided where our, electoral votes are going. So when you can vote a third party in that regard. So, but yeah, it's generally very liberal. I grew up in a household. My parents always voted Democrat. I have my whole life as well. And also a non-religious household. Just church was never a part of our lives. So, has been introduced through you though, Chris. So I do definitely value our friendship. I miss a lot of the talks we used to have that we don't get to see each other as much. But True Life Church was, sort of the most positive Christian influence I've seen, in my life, other than individuals like you, my whole life. So.
Well, appreciate that. But for the sake of clarity, so you still wouldn't consider yourself a Christian or a religious person in any regard, correct?
No, not at all.
Okay. So before we even get into anything, for those people out there who are friends, because you guys are friends, we've spent time together in Adam Hutchinson's basement debating different things, being part of a Monday night group that purposefully put forth things that were controversial, and we debated it. What lessons have you two learned about how to disagree with level-headedness and still remain friends? Any thoughts on that for people out there who feel like, man, I just can't talk to anybody about politics unless they are absolutely right in my lane, which is kind of what happens unless you're on social media. Then you can just put out your views and see what happens. But it seems like most people try to avoid talking to somebody that they know they disagree with.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of a don't ask, don't tell philosophy in a lot of areas, especially, at work and things where, even neighbors, you wonder about putting up lawn signs or things like that, because sometimes it's just easiest, or, you find it's best just not to know. But something you said, Chris, there made me think about meeting in Adam's basement. And I wonder if that was part of the way that Tom and I met. And, we met over long form discussions, where we had the opportunity to speak our minds on a lot of different issues. And it wasn't just little sound bites. And, it maybe gave us, I know it gave me the opportunity to really listen to what Tom had to say and sort of value his opinions, and realize that, the guy knew what he's talking about. But for one, and even if I disagree with him, Tom can always explain himself well, has good reason for feeling the way he does. It's not, a Facebook meme he saw that, colored his entire, voting decisions. So, and then, I think above all, the reason I find that I can deal or that we can remain friends, at least for my respect for him there, is that Tom's always, or he's never hypocritical. That Tom, I find your opinions tend to be consistent. If they were to change, you have good reason to do so, but you are not one to follow the Republican Party line, which I really respect. And so as far as what makes it possible, I think it's just that I think it did help to have that long introduction, getting to know each other well over a period where it wasn't just, at one party and, somebody comes busting in and is going on about Trump or whatever. I mean, we met pre-Trump days. So, yeah, so I think that's part of it. So kind of rambling, but.
No, that's good. That's good, man.
No, I think to play off of that, a couple things for me tend to help. One, I think for me personally, my personality is to not get too emotional about most things. So I don't fly off the handle about too much, so I can handle some of the things that people would, I guess, say get more passionate and potentially blow up about without getting too passionate and blowing up. And so that's just a personal thing for me. But two, sort of facing someone with differing views, it helps to not just interact purely about politics. Like in those days in Adam's basement, I mean, there would be some political discussions, but we'd also be playing pool or shuffleboard and talking about our families and stuff. And as you get to know people, like knowing Leigh, I know that we disagree on most political and social issues of the day, so to speak. But I also got to know the person, not just the political belief, which is, I think, super important. I think we elevate a person's political belief as to way too much of their being, way too much of their person. Like that becomes more important than what you are in almost any other category if you're, conservative or liberal, Democrat or Republican in some circles. So I think not elevating that as the most important characteristic of a person is important. And two, getting to know the other characteristics of a person. Like I think even when Leigh and I disagree, heatedly, I maintain my respect for him and still like him as a friend, because I know he's a good guy, he's a thoughtful guy, and I respect the heck out of him. As I know him to be, a dedicated husband and father who cares for and raises his family, and these are things I can respect in any man, no matter what their political views. I can respect that about him, and that makes him someone that you want to be friends with and want to be around. So even though we disagree frequently, all right, I don't elevate those disagreements as more important than the kind of man that I know him to be, or the friendly interactions we have.
Thanks, Tom.
And try not to let it get personal whilst disagreeing. Like any personal attacks while disagreeing politically, I think, is just setting yourself up for failure. So I'm intentional about avoiding that, and I think that's helpful.
Thank you for the kind words. You definitely are more of a calmer demeanor than I am. There have been more than a few text exchanges where I'm sure you could tell on the other end of it, I'm just like, strangling my phone. Like, I should take a break before sending this, and I'm firing this off. I'm filters off, whatever. But yeah. So yeah, that definitely. I mean, to be honest, that probably helps, because if you have a difference, a difference of opinion or an argument there, and you have two people who are both ones to ratchet it up and get a little angry or heated, then it can quickly blow out of control. And if you have both that are super kind of calm and hanging back, and maybe you never really touch on the you don't push the buttons enough. I don't know. So
that's a good point.
That might be part of it too. But I hate to say, Tom, you made some very good points about really getting to know the person. I hate to say that, like, it's just you're the only one that I know. I don't know a lot of people though that I disagree with as much as you, that I feel as comfortable speaking with though. But I think a lot of it is just getting to know somebody. There's the myth, the mythical, whatever it is, if it's the diehard Republican, or the crazy, Berkeley liberal, or left-wing, extremist or whatever. But when you get to actually know people and talk to them, and I mean, again, with just my relationship with you, Chris, prior to meeting you, most of the sort of Christian influences in my life were negative, or the things I saw in the news or read about or experienced, there was a lot of just negative things. And it was, sitting down and having quality time with you guys, and kind of, really, really changed my outlook, just on the religion overall, and realizing that, yes, you guys, might be part of a particular sect or whatever this, your grouping within Christianity, but it certainly doesn't define who you are. So that's really important. Do you feel like, Tom, do you feel in a way like the party's leaving you at all, or do you find yourself distancing yourself from the party?
Not entirely. I think, honestly, I think that would be more of a question for you, to be quite honest with you. And I don't know how you feel about it, but if you look at some of the research, like Pew Research has done polling on this as to sort of where liberals and conservatives stand on the same views over time. And they did polling back in like 95, 96 on 10 parameters, looking for, where do people call themselves liberal, where do they stand on this? And there's a bell curve of sort of where they stand. And then they did the same thing for people who are conservative and sort of where they stand on those issues. And they did it again 20 years later, and they saw both sides had shifted out towards what would be considered the more extreme view, right, in a number of different areas. So the left got more left, the right got more right. Right, but they noted that the left actually got significantly more left from the midline than the right got more right from the midline. So the left has shifted a bit further radically left, and the right has shifted radically right, although they both shifted apart from the midline. There's less overlap than there ever has been. That was about 2016, 2017. Pew Research did that, if you want to look into that. So I don't feel too much like that's left. What I feel happens is there's too much requirement of uniformity and thing, like everybody's got to be on board with like everything that that the Republicans do, or everybody's got to be on board with everything that the Democrats do, and if you're not, you're some sort of apostate. You're some sort of infidel who's disobeying the thing. So in these days, you got to be on board with everything Trump's doing, otherwise you're sort of on the outs. That I don't get. I think that happens in ways on both sides, but I'd be interested to see if you feel like that's happening to you on the left or not, or if you feel like they're just coming to you.
I found it interesting that you mentioned, that you were thinking that, it would that statement would apply more to me than it does to you. I guess maybe if you're just basing it on the, that poll you referenced, in the study. So, again, I feel like it does sort of change all the time. But as far as, I think what we all want to see from our leadership is somebody who has the same values we do, and, and values puts the same, amount of importance on things. So as a liberal, to me, that's on education and on scientific opportunities, and about giving everybody from the poorest poor, to the middle class, more of an opportunity, to be sure that, social justice is there and people aren't discriminated against because of their sexual orientation or their skin color or anything else. So, that's on a high level sort of what liberalism means to me. But, in looking for leaders that share the same values as me, to be honest, I'm not totally thrilled with Joe Biden, leading the charge, in this election. I will absolutely vote for him. But, I was excited about 12 other of the front runners, that were there, and just don't have a whole lot of excitement for him. It's another old white guy, although at the same time, Bernie's another old white guy, but I think he would be a drastically different president than Joe Biden would be. I find myself, maybe it is, if you look at the party, and I think the Democratic Party is losing some of the progressive roots, which is where I find myself distancing from the party. I wouldn't consider myself as left. I'm seeing people that are further left of me now, which was almost never the case, in my younger days. So I find that interesting on certain topics. But as far as the party goes, I felt like, the Democratic Party is really, ignoring a huge, portion of it, with of the electorate, and and all the Bernie supporters, and most of those other Democratic candidates who are still in it were, I would say, were more progressive than Joe Biden. And if you want to get into single issue voters, I know quite a few who are Medicare for all is their number one and their primary issue. And there's something where neither Joe Biden or Kamala Harris will come out and say they support it, whereas pretty much every other Democratic candidate did. So I found that really disappointing. And I think in choosing Joe Biden is the sort of safety candidate, the most moderate. And, you have to understand, though, if you're on the edges of anything, there's going to be a lot more people toward the center if you're trying to attract them, and that's how it's going to end up. And in a two-party system, ultimately, they're going to, in some ways, they come together, but as Tom mentioned, the more extremes get further out. So, the Republicans figured it out, though. Trump is pretty much on the right-wing extreme, bandpoint. He's not appealing to much of the centrists, and so far it worked for them. So. That's something I wish the Democratic Party would be more comfortable in doing, is accepting some of the more extreme endpoints.
I'm just trying to understand some of the things you said about being a conservative and being a liberal. I'm not trying to, genuinely, I'm not trying to catch you. I'm not trying to go, some stuff seems inconsistent, but I'm assuming there's a explanation that I just am missing here. So I'm gonna ask the questions to both you before anybody responds, and then whoever wants to respond can respond. So Tom, you described being a conservative, socially conservative, kind of holding to traditional values, values that maybe you grew up with in the church, values that you believe a Christian holds to. And then fiscally or economically conservative, meaning kind of government's hands off and government's, giving us individual choice, not stepping in to regulate, not stepping in to rescue constantly. Is that an okay summary?
Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate.
And then Leigh, you described being a liberal, largely about looking out for the little guy, the most vulnerable among us, right? Those who are outcasts on the fringes, making sure they're being cared for, included, helped, provided for. Correct?
Okay.
So, Tom, my question is, how can one be socially conservative? So I'll give you an example. So abortion, okay? Not that we have to get into the abortion debate in this one. I'm not trying to do that just yet. That'll come in a future one. Not trying to get that just yet, but just the understanding of what it means to be a conservative. Abortion, your value is I hold to life, right? And so the government has a responsibility to protect that vulnerable life. Now, if there were less abortions, presumably there'd be more kids who need to be provided for by the government. And would you say, well, there's a little bit of a trade-off, and I would go in that case, I would say, no, I'm pushing for my value of an unborn life over, my value of government being hands off, because if I had to choose one, I'd rather see the government providing for more families in order for more lives to be born. That's one question I have. And then the other question I have for you, Tom, is like, is that if the government's hands off economically, why is it okay for the government to then be hands on with some of the social stuff that you value?
Yeah.
And then Leigh, an unborn baby being, seen by many like myself as among the most vulnerable. And if the government is going to look out for them and they are going to step in and we're going to give Medicaid to all, shouldn't we be providing life to all? Because if conservative economically has to do with, you get individual choice, and liberal is no, the government has a role to play in making sure everybody's provided for. Why would that not extend to kind of an unborn baby, the most vulnerable among us? Again, those are two inconsistencies that I see in both your views. I just want you to have the opportunity to.
Okay, since you asked me first, do you want me to go first then?
Either one.
Oh, okay. So, a couple of things. You basically framed the question like, being pro-life, as it were, or anti-abortion, as it were. How to reconcile that with the possibility of more children being born if abortions were either limited or outlawed, and then having the government having to provide for that, which would violate the sort of fiscal conservatism, if you will, which is a decent question. I think there's one presupposition in there that maybe needs to be pointed out, and that that question framing assumes that all kids that are aborted because of lack of funds of the parents, which is certainly a sector of them, but there's also a sector of people who just don't want to have a kid at that point, who otherwise could have afforded to have a kid. So it assumes that all those kids are going to need to be cared for by the government, which I don't think would be true if they were to be born. But taking the rest of that, and that guaranteed there would be a segment of kids that would need to be provided for by the government, I would take that on, and there's all sorts of other ways to mitigate that, and how you sort of feel about government social programs and how much is provided along that way. But I would take that on for the sanctity of life, for sure. that holds a higher esteem, because we were talking about human life. I don't see that as government intervening in, patients' lifestyle. I'm sorry, patients. Sorry, I'm at work. in people's life, style choices and things like that. It's actually another human life that they're protecting. So that's to me holds a higher sanctity than avoiding the bill that comes along with raising that kid. So to me, that's how I reconcile that difference. And I would take on the extra population if it meant not killing unborn babies. I find that to be a much higher calling, both personally as well as from a Christian faith standpoint. I regard that. We don't have to get into it too much, but sort of my stance on abortion is the same reason that I'm against the death penalty and euthanasia. So I don't approve, or I don't stand for any situation where one human is actively ending the life of another by choice. So I would, for my stance on abortion, I would take the hit on fiscal conservatism there. And what the other section of the question was? Just remind me.
The other section of the question was, you sort of already answered it. Do you see that as the government being too hands-on with somebody's personal choice? If you are a conservative, which,
no, because I don't see the crux of the matter as the personal choice of the person, but rather the life of the child. So I think that supersedes, in my opinion.
Okay.
The other supposition there, though, that I might argue against, on the conservative side, is that saying that, well, if this means more babies are going to be born, it means more babies have to be taken care of. I would argue that a lot of the conservative and the Republican stance on abortion, tends to be, human life is of utmost importance until you're born, and then good luck, and then at that point, we're not giving you any assistance. So I don't think necessarily there's a big disconnect there, at least from a policy standpoint, because they're protecting when they're unborn, but then once the babies are born, I think the Republican Party tends to take the more hands-off approach. So
yeah.
If you want to see from the liberal standpoint, what was your point there?
Just the idea of the most vulnerable. Why does the liberal stance tend to be protect the most vulnerable until, well, a woman should have a right to choose whether or not that baby is protected, and that seems like an inconsistency. Yeah.
Ultimately, without getting into too deep in the weeds or scientific definitions of life or things like that. Ultimately, it's, you don't want to have to put any value on particular lives over others, but you find it that is, it has to be done every day now with COVID, and if there was only so many ventilators to go around, who gets them, who gets treatment first on if it's a if somebody needs a kidney, there is a value assigned there. And I think, at least in my opinion, I put more value on the mother's life than on, at that point, if you want to consider an unborn child, for the mother's existing life. So, in that regard, there is, that's how I kind of reconcile that. Ultimately, though, I do think abortion should be, safe, available, and certainly rare. I think where I find the bigger hypocritical standpoint on the right is that, the abortions have gone down under most Democratic administrations, because the things that, to me, that really work to stop them is education, is sex education, and easy access to prophylactics. So making it less likely for the pregnancy to start in the first place. So the idea that we're going to somehow keep kids from having sex, or adults for that matter, and protect it is, I think, it's unlikely, it's proven not to work. And ultimately, I think if you really truly want to be pro-life and anti-abortion, you should be pro-sex education, pro-safe sex, and giving the most information out there, without letting the social conservative aspects of your life, color that decision too much.
So that's good. That's helpful in understanding where you're coming from. And I think like I said, abortion is one worth diving into. Tom will probably want to fact check you on the what you just said about the Democratic. So we can certainly. I want to revisit that and probably have some women on for that one. Really dive into that and more get into those weeds. But that's helpful to understand you reconciling what I perceive to be an inconsistency. I would probably describe myself, for what it's worth, a little bit differently, when it comes to morality, a conservative, in the sense of give people the freedom to choose when it comes to moral choices. I don't think the government should legislate morality. I think that's a dangerous, slippery slope. I think, for example, adultery should be legal. You shouldn't be convicted of a crime if you cheat on your spouse, even though I think it's wrong. I think it's offensive to God. I think it's wrong, but I don't think it should be illegal. You know what I mean? So I'm a conservative when it comes to certain moral choices, and that extends to financial as well. But when it comes to justice, I would probably call myself more of a liberal, where I do think the government has to protect the most vulnerable among us and care for and provide for. I don't always know where to draw the line exactly between a moral issue and a justice issue. And that's kind of a question that I did prepare you guys for, is where should somebody's faith and somebody's, maybe in your case, Leigh, what you would call just your value system, how much should that inform their views on political policy? You know what I mean? Like I just use the adultery example. I think it's wrong. It should not be illegal. I think abortion is a justice issue. I think it should be. And, but again, I want to hear from you guys on how do you know where to draw the line? Because I think we've all seen both sides, the right and the left, at different times and in different ways, try to legislate a kind of morality that gets crazy.
Yeah. Tom, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you mentioned is kind of a sticking point for me and a bit of a chip on my shoulder. I think a lot of times speaking with Christians who find out maybe, that I wasn't raised in the church or don't believe in God or that Jesus is our savior, that they're like, well, where do you get your morals from? And it's like, it's society. It's, a lot of it, I know it's right and wrong. Came from my parents, and the golden rule ultimately kind of guides it all. Do unto others. So, and I'd argue in that regard, not being beholden to a higher power or a particular religion, faith, gives me a little more freedom to, I feel like, to see where those things, those morality decisions fall on my own, based on, all the, information I have, rather than having it, colored from the, what is the church standpoint, or, what does my pastor say about it? Or, then what does the church as a whole say about it? What does the Pope say, and, to me, that gives less personal freedom, I think. I mean, obviously any Christian has a choice to choose when and where they want to follow the church and how they want to interpret the Bible. But I think that's one case where, not being beholden to a religion is a good thing.
Interesting.
Tom?
So from my standpoint, I am, coming from a religious background, I think your religious beliefs should actually supersede any political affiliation you have. All right, so they should be the top thing, but by following those, you would generally fall, into a certain, I guess, religious political grouping, generally speaking, not always, but your religious beliefs should supersede any political beliefs that you have, but they would certainly color what then gets broken down as political beliefs regarding morality, all right, and things like that. So using Christian standards for morality would generally put you on a conservative political belief, again, not necessarily believing it for the good of one certain party, but for for the worship, for the following of Jesus Christ. Believing in that. Again, I think the politics have to be secondary to your religious beliefs from a religious person's standpoint. So that's how I feel that personally it should affect it for me. A big problem that I think we run into, and Chris, you can cut me off if you need to move on to something else, but a big problem that we run into that is, I think people's political beliefs become their religion more progressively in our current society. And Lee, I'll give you a chance to rebut later. I think this is predominant on the left, but it does happen on both sides. And someone, as I was saying before, elevating someone's political affiliation as to like the highest or most important characteristic of them is nonsense. And I think people have invested too much of themselves in their political beliefs, have staked the sort of the essence of their lives and the good versus evil based on which political party you stand for, which I think is entirely detrimental to society. And you see it in current like cancel culture, outrage mobs that are everywhere. Like if you stray from the political orthodoxy, I mean, they're getting you fired, kicked out of whatever circle of society that you're in. I mean, you have to be excommunicated because when you stray from the pack, and that's religious zealotry. That's not level-headed. That's not even political ideology. That's religious zealotry, right? And reasons why I say I think that exists a bit more on the left. Frequently, I'll say the area that you have in your life for religious or beliefs where you have to suspend a little bit logic and reason to the things you've been taught. So let's say from a political standpoint, we have to believe that a virgin gave birth, right? So scientifically, we know that that's not logical, all right? But we have to believe that that's a matter of faith. That's a leap of faith beyond what we know and in the scientific and what we know. We have to believe that a man died for 3 days and rose again to pay for our sins. These things are not scientific, or what some people might call logical concepts, but we have that area in our lives where we have faith. It takes faith to put your trust or belief in that, all right? And we have feelings of good and evil, religious, structures for that, religious, persons, for that. That should be reserved for religion. I think it bleeds too much into politics. I mean, if you just look at how people treat the current president, right? It's like he's the absolute embodiment of evil. Everything he does is wrong and terrible. He commits 12 federal crimes before breakfast. Everything he says is awful, and nothing he says is ever good. That sort of absolutism, extremism, is reserved for fantasy characters and religious idols. All right. So the embracing of that in our society, again, I think predominantly on one side versus the other, but I'll let Lee respond to that if he wants, is religious zealotry more than its political affiliation. And I think that's destructive for us. And I think one of the reasons why I think it's less prevalent on the right is because for that area in your life that you reserve for religious faith, there's religion. Whereas we're on the left, there's a lot less of that, and that space is taken up by political ideology in a lot more cases.
And that's the team that you associate with more, So if you had to pick the overall team that you're on in life of you against the world, would you say it's as a Christian you identify the most there?
Oh yeah, as far as like what's the top level like of association, like I'm a Christian and then I'm this, I'm a Christian who happens to be also in this, subcommittee. Yeah. So yeah, I would put that above political ideology and affiliation. I think it certainly colors it. I think it certainly and, if you're following your religious, beliefs, it's going to put you into, in a lot of cases, that category. But you'll see in coming weeks, the people in our same church as me, same religion as me, have a lot different views on some things than I do. So, but I think you need to put the religious importance first, all right, and let that color your political ideology, not make it your political ideology.
No, some really, really good points there, and I do, I don't disagree with what you said, especially about, if the left generally would skew more non-religious, and then, looking for a sort of identity that might identify more with politics. I would have a whole podcast discussion about, election reform. I think is one of the most important things that we could do to let more alternative viewpoints come out. By distilling everything down to two parties is just fans the flames of that us versus them mentality, the teams, and sort of like, we got to win, and we have to win and somebody else has to lose, and it's not good for anybody. So there are a lot of reforms there, getting rid of first past the post voting, having more proportional representation as an option. There's a lot of reforms. Overturning Citizens United would be huge. So, a lot of things too, back to where has the party left you? I think both parties have kind of shown they're beholden to big business ultimately. And that's everyone's true God is capitalism, is the almighty dollar. You look at Donald Trump and come on, as Christians, you have to look at that man and say, okay, he is not the embodiment of a Christian, straight up. And so I'm just trying to think where I'm going with that.
While you're coming back to that, Lee, I did want to address something that you had mentioned before, when you were describing sort of yourself as a liberal, or liberalism and things you cared about, which I don't think are necessarily exclusive to liberals. And you're saying that you didn't want people to be discriminated against for sexual orientation or skin color, all right, things like that, which I think, I think a lot of people who wouldn't call themselves liberals would agree with that. But you said that, and about 2 minutes later, you were lamenting the fact that Joe Biden was a white man. Mm-hmm. So how do you reconcile not wanting anyone to be discriminated against by their skin color, and then just fretting over the fact that the guy in a certain position has white skin?
Again, I'm just looking for a different viewpoint. And, yes, it's certainly by putting a woman or a person of color to the highest, office is not going to guarantee a different viewpoint. And chances are, if it ends up being, President Harris in 2024, there's still going to be a lot of big pro-business and we're probably not going to be any closer to universal health care, and we'll see where we end up on climate change. But the idea that our country has had 44 white male presidents and one half black male president is kind of, there's a lot more to the US, and I just think we really benefit just from having another viewpoint. And sometimes you do need to hire more women or more minorities if they're not getting the position straight up, because you need to have that viewpoint. So
I think there's a semi-false assumption, assuming that a different skin color or a different set of genitalia necessarily gives you a diversity of viewpoint in all areas. Like, there's some areas where it will inherently go along with, but not necessarily, because you and Barack Obama have a lot more in common viewpoint-wise than me and Barack Obama.
Yes.
Or me and you.
Yes.
I think using necessarily those immutable characteristics of people to assign value to their viewpoint is probably a bit of treacherous ground.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I'm not saying necessarily applying value, but just understanding, the different experience that will shape your opinion. And, yes, absolutely. And there are plenty of Black conservatives out there, or, or whatever, if you want to come up with examples that don't go along with the majority. But I still think, in general, come on, the US population is more than half women. We should have women in charge to at least see what they're, there's going to be a different viewpoint. There's going to be a different experience that shapes their opinion, and there are going to be things that, that they might understand differently than a man would. I mean, but along the same lines, you can identify, if you want to start identifying as a minority, as a atheist, I don't get, much representation in government, or at least nobody's out. It's almost it's political suicide if you out yourself as an atheist, So I think we would, we're going to have probably a woman president before we have an outed atheist president, or a gay president even. I think it's, in politics now, it's worse to be an atheist than it is to be gay, probably. But
Interesting. That's interesting. Tom, can I put a question to you? Do you think that you said you feel like the left these days are more trying to legislate a kind of morality? Do you feel like the right would you agree that the right tried to do it more in the 80s and 90s?
I think traditionally, yeah. I mean, that's where it's been, and it depends on what you consider morality, all right, as to what they're legislating and what moral values that you're trying to legislate. And I'm mostly with you in not legislating morality, because I don't consider abortion to be legislating morality. There's a life involved there that you're saving. So, but yeah, like you, I mean, if someone wants to do something disreputable, I mean, that's on them, but we don't necessarily need to legislate, against, adultery, or, even like, there's some like ancient laws about certain like sexual positions or acts that were not, allowed in certain districts. And I mean, the sort of bedroom stuff, I really don't think we should be legislating, because, that I don't think is really the government's place. But yeah, I think traditionally some of the more conservative groups in the past had, tried to legislate what was considered morality at that point. And it really depends if you're bringing an abortion into that, because I would take that out of it.
I would take that out of it too, but I think there's other things, whether it's
could you throw out a few examples as to?
I think many would argue that gay marriage is a moral issue, not a justice issue.
So yeah, I mean, from a state institution, like I said, I don't necessarily need to stand against gay marriage. I went to a gay wedding on Sunday. Like these are like this. I wouldn't necessarily bring that into the church, but from a legal representation, like from a state standpoint, I don't think they necessarily need to legislate that. No.
Back to you said something before about identifying as a Christian first, or how that might shape your morality and your view of the law or justice. I mean, above all, I personally feel that separation of church and state is paramount, and it was part of the entire point of the founding of our country, was not having a state religion or any sort of organized religion, being the official religion of the country. I mean, Christianity has kind of become a de facto. Most court cases are, you're swearing in a Bible. The president is sworn in on a Bible.
It started out that way. It didn't necessarily become that way. It was founded by Christians.
There were other things too at the time, but so I feel like it's got no part, and it shouldn't be, it shouldn't be part of it, and it the idea that you have potentially somebody like Mike Pence who's saying he answers to God first and the Constitution second, and it's like, well, I don't know, I didn't put you in, I'm not asking you about God and your feelings in religion. I'm asking you about, what you want for the laws of our country and enforcing it in the executive branch. So we've had some really good discussions about this at Adams, about, we all just kind of have to choose our own points where we're going to draw the line. And there are going to be areas of the Bible that you're going to discount entirely, even as a Christian, plenty of tattooed Christians or, gay, and don't find any problem with that, whereas, there are others who are going to point to that. So I think, you've always got to choose to draw the line somewhere based on your own personal morality. whether that's against, what the Bible might say or against what the laws are. I mean, we all have choices where, we decide, hey, this is the law of the land, but we're not going to follow it because we ultimately disagree with it. We have a moral, dissension to it. So I think that can transcend, religious boundaries or political boundaries or anything. We all have our own personal idea of morality, what's right and what's wrong. And I think, we're ultimately going to act on that, regardless of what the law says potentially, or what the party says, or what our religion says.
Yeah, and to your separation of church and state point, Leah, by me saying that the religion should supersede your political views, I don't want you to think that meant that religion should control, legislation and politics. Like, I'm not looking for someone to pass a law, to stop working on the Sabbath or to.
I always find it hilarious when there's the fear of we're electing Muslims and there's going to be Sharia law, but we need to govern based on what the Bible says. Like,
there was one more question I wanted to touch on that I don't know if it makes sense to try to in this one. We might just have to schedule a second one with you, Lee. And that was the one about which side disregards science more. Should we try to touch on it?
I got some minutes.
I can roll it out. I mean, there's one issue that it baffles me that it's not the biggest issue on everybody's mindset, beyond coronavirus right now in the short term. And it's tough because as humans, we have a hard time looking at the long term and looking at things on a longer timeline. But climate change, there was one Democratic candidate of the field, who hitched his horse to that wagon. It was the governor of Oregon, right? Inslee.
I think it sounds right.
I think it's, but to me, it is the most, important issue of our day to act on now. And I think the Republican Party has kind of, got into this idea, ignoring the science, which is clear, that, global warming and climate change is directly affected and caused by acts of, what humans have done. And that we have the chance now, by acting now, to reverse some of that, or at least freeze it and prevent it from getting worse. And the idea that we're going to, prop up a couple coal mines or something, and, or say we don't have the money to pay for these things while, building, aircraft carriers is just baffling to me, because I think ultimately the science is clear, and, and the Republican Party has chosen to ignore it.
And do you want me to respond to that, or how I think the left ignores science?
Yeah, why don't you just mention how you feel like the left, because that deserves its own topic, and okay. We're laying the groundwork tonight here.
Yeah. So in my opinion, the way that one of the ways, I'll say, at least the one that kind of sticks in my craw the most, the much simpler, much more settled science of the X and Y chromosome. So people who deny a universal truth that we have known since the existence of our species, and all of a sudden we don't know it anymore, that a man is a man and a woman is a woman and you're born one or the other. Like, the denial of that science is what baffles my mind. And okay. Like, I will put myself up as a climate change agnostic. I haven't read the science. I'm just going to take Lee's word for it at this point, because I haven't gotten into enough of it. But from a medical standpoint, and what sort of the advancements of the opinions on transgender ideology, especially as it applies to transgender children, which bothers me significantly more. Kids who are prepubescent being put on hormone blockers, life-altering things, using body-altering surgery and lifetime hormones for a gender dysphoria, being a psychologically based problem. The denial of that science by the left is what I guess stands out to me the most.
Okay, so you both brought up one example that's both definitely worth full-on discussions about. Lee, I gotta say, man, if you had time to jump into the part 2 next week, I know you only committed to one.
Yeah, I could do it. I think I can do it. I'm a little more comfortable now, probably. So.
I mean, if we come back next time, I think it would be good to touch on your points where you're saying where we don't traditionally line up exactly with the other conservatives or the other liberals in our viewpoints, things like that.
That'd be good. That would be good. Yeah. This is good though, guys. Thank you so much for being willing to go first. Yeah, I have a lot of respect for you guys for that, and I've always enjoyed getting the two of you together and hearing you. I learn a lot from you guys. Leigh, I know you don't mind. I know you well enough to know that you won't mind if I pray for the people who are going to be listening to this through this. So, yeah, Jesus, I just thank you for Leigh and Tom being willing to talk and just share how they're navigating through lining up their values with their politics and also modeling just the ability to have a reasonable, respectful conversation with each other. God, I pray that there's other people out there who not only learned from today some things and maybe even are challenged to think twice about labeling others or assuming that somebody who disagrees with them must fall in a particular category. But I also pray that it would lead to people having conversations, a willingness to have conversations with those that they disagree with. That's our hope, God. And again, I just thank you for these two friends of mine. In your name. Amen.
Amen.
Yeah, guys. Really.
Thank you, Chris. I'm very thankful for this opportunity as well. It's always really, really just always a positive experience seeing you guys.